My name is Mark, a recording angel. I've been observing this earth since the dawn of creation. The Most High has asked me to share my recordings with you. The following are my records of Earth's earliest patriarchs and prophets, collected in this book, Survivors of the Dark Rebellion, God's Heroes from Adam to David. If today's recording contains situations which might be uncomfortable for younger listeners, I will mark the video with the words Parental Guidance Recommended. Chapter 8, Part 1, Senefru. The transition from being a recorder for Melinda and my next human was a simple one. I love it when the Almighty provides me with such continuity between my assignments. Melinda married her metalworker, Kenan, and moved to Egypt where there was more metalwork available. Kenan set up a shop and has done quite well. Senefru, his son, stood and stretched his back. Perspiration poured from him, and he was glad for the light headdress that protected him from the sun. "Time to switch places," his father grunted. The boy nodded thankfully and moved over to the bellows. Placing his foot on them, he started pumping as his father bent over the forge, watching for the copper ingots to melt so he could pour the metal in the clay molds. "This is hard work," Senefru said, more to himself than his father. Kenan paused and eyed his son. "Yes, it is hard work, but it could be a lot worse." The boy wiped his forehead. "Hotter than this?" His father shook his head. "No, probably not, but we are free men. We could be slaves. Their lives are worse, and I'm sure they're just as hot laboring in the brickyards, in the fields, and on the building projects." Senefru sighed. It was true. At least when he and his father did their work, no one stood over them with a whip. He had grown up in Egypt, so unless someone pointed them out, he tended to ignore the slaves and their plight. His father was a man of few words, but seemed more interested in the slaves than a normal Egyptian should. The boy shrugged. Most of his friends mentioned little things about their fathers that embarrassed them, too. As if able to read his thoughts, his father looked him in the eye and said, "They're people, too, you know." Embarrassed, Senefru stared at his feet. "Who do you mean?" "You know who I mean, and they are people, too. Someday they will be free, and when that happens, the few that have been kind to them will be glad they were." The boy eyed the bent, scarred backs of the brickmakers, slowly dragging their loads past them, and shook his head. He was pretty sure slaves didn't have the same kinds of feelings as normal people. They certainly didn't seem to, anyway. At any rate, it wasn't his problem, and he planned to have as little to do with them as possible. Perhaps being the son of a metalsmith wasn't so bad, after all. There was something different about today. Although Senefru could not put his finger on what it was, yet he could feel it in his bones. At breakfast, his mother had seemed excited, or uptight, he wasn't sure which. She and his father conversed in low tones for a few moments before they left. "Is something important happening?" he asked his father as they walked toward the street of the metalworkers. "Things may be changing soon, you'll see." "What kind of things?" His father mumbled something. "What does that mean?" his son asked. "It's best that we not talk about it right now." Senefru kicked a rock. Typical. Here he was, practically a man, but no one would tell him anything. All of the metalworkers had their shops in an area near the building projects. Since the pharaoh was their biggest customer, and owned and supplied all the raw materials, it made sense to work where it was most convenient for him and his projects. Egyptians operated the shop next to Kenan's. The owners had some of the Hebrew slaves there working for them. Senefru secretly hoped that someday he and his father would be doing well enough financially to buy a few slaves. It would certainly lighten his load. Today, father was acting strangely. When the shop next to them stopped for their mid-morning break and the slaves went over to the goatskin bag of water hanging on the wall, father paused near them. Even though he was facing in a different direction, he seemed to be whispering to them. Senefru casually sauntered by to see if he could hear what they were talking about. "Yes," Oholiab, one of the slaves, said almost inaudibly. "He is here. Came last night. He is staying in the house of Aaron. Too bad his parents have died." More whispering. Senefru headed back to his shop to overhear more of the conversation. "Yes, his two sons are with him. His wife, I understand, came part way with him. Then she returned to Midian." The boy's ears perked up. How did his father have anything to do with slaves? It wasn't difficult for me to figure out what Kenan and the slaves were talking about, but then I knew who was back in Egypt. I had seen his guardian the previous night. That afternoon, the scribe, who was Kenan's contact for business, strode into their shop. Kenan put his hammerstone down. "Let's take a break for a minute," he said to his son. Senefru was only too happy to comply. He removed his foot from the bellows and stretched his aching back. "What is the commotion at the palace?" Kenan asked his visitor. The scribe laughed. "Such excitement you're missing today. I'm glad I don't work at a job like yours." Senefru bristled at the comment, but one sharp look from his father reminded him to keep silent, at least until the man had left. "You wouldn't believe who has come back to town," the man continued. "You remember the stories of Moses? I must admit I was a child when all that happened, but it was hot news. He was our military leader and considered the son of the pharaoh, or at least a pharaoh's daughter. Everyone thought he would be the next pharaoh when the old king died. Then he started hanging around the slaves, and next thing you know he was taking their side against the overseers. At least that's what I heard. Apparently he killed one. And that's bad for discipline. You start having someone take their side, and pretty soon you can't get any of them to obey. It's bad for discipline all over. He wasn't doing the country any favors. Pharaoh knew it. That's why he got rid of him. Moses ran away, or something. Anyway, he's back in town after 40 years. Perhaps he thought we'd forgotten who he was by now. Strange. He doesn't look as old as he must be. Strode right into the palace as if he hadn't been gone a week. Acted as if he owned the place." The chatty Egyptian shook his head. "It was as if he hadn't left. Now he just walked right in, interrupted the court proceedings, and announced to the pharaoh it was time to let all the slaves go free. At least all the Hebrew slaves." "Free?" the boy's father asked. "Well, not exactly," the Egyptian backpedaled. "He said, something about letting them all go out in the desert to make a sacrifice to their god. As if any king in his right mind is going to let an entire population of slaves run off in the middle of the desert somewhere to worship a god that isn't even a proper Egyptian deity." He laughed and then stopped when he realized he was the only one seeing anything amusing. "What did the pharaoh say?" Kenan asked. "Well, he said no, of course, but what was really amazing was that this Moses fellow had the gall to threaten him." "He threatened the pharaoh?" Senefru blurted. "Yes, young one. Did a couple of magic tricks that our magicians duplicated, and then told him his god was going to do bad things to the pharaoh if he didn't let them go. The nerve of him. Of course, nothing happened, and we all laughed at him, but it amazes me that he had the nerve to do it." "Did the pharaoh do anything about him?" Kenan questioned, looking worried. "Not a thing. He figures all those years out with the sand dwellers have affected his mind. Besides, he was a part of the royal family at one time, so I suppose they're dealing gently with him. They just let him go. He may be insane, but he seems harmless." Senefru wondered if the incident could have anything to do with his father's whispered conversation with the Holiab, the slave from the next metal shop. Was this part of the mysterious discussion between his parents? "Anyway," the scribe continued, "I came to pick up those knives that we ordered last week, and to let you know about how many spear tips we're going to need. They have just recruited a new batch of Nubians, so we'll be needing to equip them." Kenan brought the knives. "Meanwhile, keep an eye out for that Moses fellow," the scribe added. "He's a harmless idiot, but the pharaoh doesn't want him hurt. I suppose out of respect for what he used to be." As the man left, Senefru turned to his father. "So we have one more crazy old man in town." His father just gave him a strange look. "There's nothing crazy about Moses," Kenan said finally, "and if the pharaoh is smart, he'll remember that soon." "You know something about this man? Tell me, did you run into him in the desert when you travel with the merchant caravans?" "You might say that, but the less said the better. Come on, we've got spearheads to cast." "But father," Senefru protested. His father's jaw was set. "Get pumping those bellows, son. This fire isn't hot enough to melt a thing." Senefru returned to working the bellows to heat up the coals. "I don't know why we have to do this part of the work ourselves," he mumbled to himself. "If we had slaves like the other metal workers, we could let them handle this part of the job." He frequently felt jealous of Bezaleel and Oholiab. No matter how hard he and his father worked and how perfect their instruments and bowls and knives turned out, they never looked as good next to their neighbors' wares. The slaves worked with gold, and even that rarest of all metals in Egypt, silver. Again and again his father had told him not to be envious. Pharaoh is going to use a lot more bronze spear tips than they will golden bowls. The monies and the items that have the most demand. We're in the right business. Senefru sighed. It might be true, but he still wished he worked in the next shop. That evening, instead of stretching out and relaxing after supper, his father motioned to him. "Get your cloak, Senefru." "Where are we going?" But his mother and father had both pulled on their outer cloaks and started out the door. He followed quickly. As they left the familiar part of town, his suspicion started rising. "Where are we going?" he asked his father again. "Are you sure you know the right place? We're heading right for the slave quarters." "Shh!" his father said. "You must not speak unless we're alone. Just keep your eyes and ears open. You'll understand in time." Senefru grudgingly did as he was told. His eyes widened as he walked into the slave district. He wasn't sure it was even safe to be here. What was father thinking? Then his parents turned into a small alley and knocked on a door. The three of them heard a muffled response. "It is Kenan," his father announced. "Son-in-law of Jethro, priest of Midian." "Priest of where?" Senefru wondered. "Son-in-law? Did that mean this Jethro person was his grandfather? Mother's father?" The door opened and an elderly slave woman stood before them, but Mother rushed past her and hugged the two boys standing in the corner. Senefru stared in amazement. Who were these people? Then, as if his father had heard his thoughts out loud, he said, "Senefru, these are your cousins." The boy stared at the young men. "Their names are Gershom and Eliezer," father continued. His son studied the two strangers. Gershom was definitely older than he was, while Eliezer was closer to his age. "I understand why you came here last night when you arrived," Senefru's mother said. "But wouldn't you be more comfortable staying at our place? And why didn't your mother come with you?" "Father sent her back home," Gershom explained. "He said she would not be happy when the plagues came. Our father always says our mother has a sensitive nature. He says that we'll have to leave before long, too." "Plagues?" Senefru repeated, puzzled. Then his father spoke. "This will work out well. We have just received an order from the Pharaoh for new spearheads, and we could use an extra couple pairs of hands. Gershom and Eliezer can help us in our shop." Senefru shook his head. His father was trying to be diplomatic to the slaves again. Why did he bother? "This will work out well," Kenan repeated. "You boys will work with me, but we must not speak of this. It is critically important that no one find out that you are the sons of Moses." Senefru's mouth dropped open. The sons of Moses? The Moses who had just threatened Pharaoh that morning? Was it safe to be associated with him in any way? Apparently father hadn't thought about that, for the two boys quickly gathered up their few belongings and headed out of the tiny slave dwelling. It was good to have two more pairs of hands in the metalworking shop, even if they were inexperienced ones. Senefru's father obtained a second set of bellows and additional blowpipes to heat the metalworking fires. Gershom and Eliezer were able to pump the bellows or use the blowpipes with very little training, while Senefru and his father poured the molten bronze into the clay spearhead molds. Gershom was fascinated with the goldsmiths next door. "What are they doing?" he questioned. "They aren't doing things the same way we do." "Of course not," Senefru scoffed. "They're working with gold." "That's more beautiful than copper or bronze," Gershom observed. Senefru nodded. "They can beat gold into a really thin layer they call gold leaf. Then they put it on statues and furniture and the insides of buildings." "I've heard of such things," Gershom said, "but I've never seen it." "Keep those bellows going, boys," father declared. "I don't mind you talking, but you can't stop pumping." I smiled to myself. With so many new things to look at, it's no wonder they were distracted. Suddenly a man stumbled into the metalworkers' quarter, dripping with sweat and looking frightened. "The Nile is bleeding," he gasped. Work came to an abrupt halt as everyone gathered around the distraught individual. "The Nile! I think it's dying," he struggled to get the words out. "When Pharaoh went down to the river this morning to praise Hapi, as he does every morning, Moses was there to meet him." "Moses? Who's Moses?" interrupted one metalworker.
You know," another responded. "The crazy man who wants Pharaoh to allow all the Hebrew slaves go out in the desert."
Senefru glanced at Eliezer, but the boy kept his eyes firmly fixed on the toe of his sandal. "Anyway," the first man continued after catching his breath, "this Moses was standing there at the river, and he struck the water with his rod, and it turned into blood, and the whole river has become blood."
Can it be true?" someone asked. "Let's go see."
"May we go, father?" Senefru said. "No, we have plenty of work to do. If it's true, we'll find out soon enough. Now get back to work." Silently, the boys returned to their duties. But it seemed only minutes before word came back that blood filled the entire Nile. Not just colored water. It smelled terrible and was undrinkable. "What are we going to do?" Senefru questioned his father. "Nothing. It isn't our problem. This is between Moses and Pharaoh and all his magicians. We have work to do." He continued to break open the spearhead molds. Then he took the tongs he had been using to handle the hot objects and stuck them in a water vat to cool them down. They made their usual hiss and steam. Suddenly, Kenan cried out in shock. The boys dropped what they were doing and rushed to see what was wrong. Even the water in the vat had turned to blood, and the tongs had a strange crust on them. A familiar stench filled the air. "Dried blood?" Senefru asked. Unable to speak, Kenan nodded. The boys stared at the tongs. "Let's go home," Kenan sighed. "We can't continue without water." They silently went through the duties of shutting down the workshop and heading for home. The streets were filled with workers unable to finish what they were doing. Everyone was talking about the water.
"It's not just the Nile," someone commented. "The irrigation canals and even the water in our drinking jars and buckets are full of blood."
Panic seemed to linger just below the surface.
What are we going to do?"
Everyone asked. When the four men reached their home, they found Mother working in the shade in the yard. "Have you heard?" Kenan asked. She nodded. "Yes, and we've also heard that Pharaoh has called his counselors to the palace to find out how to deal with the situation." "Well," her husband replied, "we can't just sit around. I think the boys and I will go down near the Nile and try digging a well, or at least a small hole close by, and see if we can get fresh water that way." The boys groaned. It had almost sounded as if they might have an afternoon off. Reluctantly, they picked up wooden shovels and digging sticks and followed Kenan toward the river. Senefru and his father returned with 2 small leather buckets of water that they had painstakingly scooped from a little hole by the Nile. Mother had just returned from the marketplace with some food for supper. "We have some water, Mother," Senefru said, holding up the bucket. "But not very much. It doesn't look all that clean. You may want to pour it through a cloth or something a couple times, but it's better than what's flowing down the Nile." "Thank you, boys. I'm glad that the Lord has left a way for us still to get a little water, or we'd all die before we ever left this place." "Left this place?" Senefru sputtered. "We're not going anywhere." Kenan interrupted. "I'm sure your mother didn't mean to say that." "My mistake," Mother said. "Anyway, there's news in the market from Pharaoh. Apparently the wise men were also able to turn water into blood at the palace, so Pharaoh believes it's just a trick." "What a powerful piece of magic!" Senefru exclaimed, turning to Gershom and Eliezer. "Does your father do stuff like this at home too?" They stared at each other. "No," they said. "Never." "Well, it's still really great," Senefru protested. "He must have the heart of a lion being able to stand up to Pharaoh like that." Gershom and Eliezer glanced at each other again with that same awkward look. Senefru sensed something going on between them. "What is it?" he blurted. Moses' sons awkwardly shuffled their feet and stared at the ground. Then Gershom cleared his throat. Actually, Father's usually kind of shy. He doesn't talk much, but, well, when he's nervous, he tends to stutter a bit." "Then do you think he's sort of gone a little crazy?" Senefru demanded without thinking. Moses' sons at first remained silent, and then Gershom said, "The one God sent him here to Egypt. I never wanted to return to this horrible place." "Horrible place?" Senefru echoed. "It's not that horrible," his mother interrupted. "We have a pretty good life here." "Well, of course you do," Gershom replied. "You're free, but look how the Hebrews are treated." "So?" Senefru demanded. "Probably anywhere you go, you'll find rich people and their slaves." "But these are Father's people," Gershom explained patiently. "He's a Hebrew." Confused, Senefru frowned to himself. His cousins were from Midian, so he assumed that they were Midianites, though they said that they were descended from Abraham. However, they were from Abraham's second wife, Keturah, and his sons, not through Isaac, the promised one. "Well," Gershom continued, "the God of the Hebrews, whom my grandfather also worships, has chosen Moses to lead them out of Egypt in slavery. The only one wants to make the great nation that he promised Abraham a long time ago. Moses is just here doing what the one God told him to." "Why do you keep calling him the one God?" Senefru asked. "There are hundreds of gods here in Egypt. The great ones Pharaoh serves, and the lesser ones the ordinary people worship, but still lots of them. So who is this one God, and doesn't he have a name?" "He tells Moses his name is I Am." "I Am?" Senefru frowned again. This god was as confusing as his Uncle Moses. The boy would stick with the familiar Egyptian gods. It just made more sense.
This broadcast has come from the book Survivors of the Dark Rebellion by Sally Pierson Dillon, with permission from the Review and Herald Publishing Association. This book and the rest of the series, War of the Ages, can be purchased by going to www.adventistbookcenter.com or by calling 1-800-765-6955. I'm your narrator, Austin Backus, and this audio project is a gift to you from my free Christian book ministry, RXF 1888. Please visit our website, www.rxf1888.com, to request free Christian books for both kids and adults. And join us here again for more stories from Mark the Recording Angel.